There's one special thing that all of these photographs behind me all have in common. Whether it's this cricket shot over here, or it's this detail shot from the docks, or it's this portrait that I really love over here. All of them, every single one, use different camera settings. I mean, there's other things they have in common as well, but that's one that stands out, which then begs the question, why do so many of us, especially early on, spend so much time trying to find the best camera settings? One of the things that'll hold us back in the creative world is that we try to find a recipe for something as opposed to learning how to cook. Instead of learning how to work with the ingredients in front of us, we try to find a universal system that we can apply to all ingredients, which doesn't quite make sense. We've all been there at some point, right? Whether it's a walk, a trip, or a project, we have something that we need to deliver on. So we go online, we type it up, we try to find the best settings for whatever we're about to do. Why? Because there's actual stakes on the line and we want to deliver the best results we can. And while that might be one way to learn, I think it might be the worst way to learn and practice photography. We are creatures of habit, and we have this brain that's constantly looking to organize the chaos that's in front of us. And this will bleed into the creative journey where we will look to build recipes and systems for something, for a look, let's call it that. And this can work against us. While this might be useful for controlled environments, a lot of the time we don't have control over our environment, over what it's gonna look like, what it's gonna feel like, and possibly even the subject that's in front of us. Let me make this a bit more personal. I don't know when I'm gonna create my next favorite photograph until after it happens. I don't know what the lighting is gonna be like, I don't know who the subject is gonna be, and I definitely don't know what part of the world it's gonna happen in. So with that in mind, it makes no sense for me to rely on one or two sets of camera settings for the work that I'm about to do. Instead, it's far more valuable for me to have a theory that I can apply to my work. Or to phrase it as a question, what if we could always be ready to create a great image in any situation? Now, some of you might jump the gun and say, Gajan, is this just another way of you talking about aperture priority? Yes and no, but what a lot of workshops and tutorials miss is that shutter speed and ISO can impact your work in a positive way, but more on that later. There's really just two systems to my theory around street photography, and the first one involves relegating much of the control back to the camera. Now, before we jump into any of that, let's just set the scene a little bit. Fundamentally, we have three variables that we can manipulate to create a great image: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Changing any one, two, or three of these will give us a different creative result, and this is where I start the conversation. What do I have in front of me, and what look am I going for? Let's start very simple. Let's say that I have all the light available to me. It is bright, it is beautiful. I can capture an image here where I have a ton of focus now, right? Because the light is on my side, I can capture the subject and the scene, these vignettes that really showcase a wider story. So with this in mind, I will set my aperture to f8 or f11. Now, given the situation, because I have light on my side, I can then have my shutter speed act at a much faster rate. In this case, maybe even 1,000 or 2,000 of a second to really stop the action, to really be able to capture the scene in front of me. And because light is on our side, I can work with a narrow range for the ISO, something like where the ceiling is ISO 400. Most of the shots that I fire here, the ISO will probably land at ISO 100, but in case there's a little bit of shade or overcast that comes through, I have a little bit of a buffer to get a more accurate exposure. So based on this scene, I'm deciding, okay, the light is this type of light. This is the image that I want to create, and from there, I'm deciding what I want the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to be. In this instance, the camera is taking over and deciding what the ISO can be, but that is something that I'm comfortable doing. Now, what if I want a different result in these same conditions? Say I want a very intimate portrait, something that melts away the background, which makes the environment almost like this cascade of colors that just brings our subject to the forefront, right? Well, in this instance, I would have to drop the aperture down, maybe f1.4 or f1.8. And because of this, I would have to drive the shutter speed even higher, maybe even a 5,000th of a second, going into an electronic shutter on the camera. I would also lock the ISO probably to ISO 64 or ISO 100. But again, based on the creative result, I'm manipulating the camera settings. This is also an instance where I might want to bring an ND filter to cut even more light to get the creative result that I'm looking for. So here, again, the result is what's driving the settings. I'm thinking ahead of time of the look that I would want to capture and then deciding where the camera settings fall. Now let's switch up the scenario again. Say that the sun is setting and I want to be able to capture a decent amount of focus where I can capture these environmental portraits, right? Well, I will look at, okay, how much of focus will I require for this image to tell the story that I'm looking for? And I might say, okay, I can bring the aperture to 5.6. And in this instance, I might want to make the floor of shutter speed, make that 1/125th of a second, where if I'm holding the camera steady and I know that I can capture the shot, that I can go lower with that shutter speed and get more light coming in. But again, in an automatic setting where the floor is 1/125 and the shutter speed can go up if there's more light in that situation. And I might also raise the ceiling of the ISO where I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, since there is less of the environment in focus, I am okay with introducing a little bit more grain since it won't show up as prominently, right? And I might say, well, let's raise that ceiling on a full frame sensor that I'm using to 1600. In this instance, I'm deciding the look that I'm going for with the aperture, and I'm letting the shutter speed sort of look at the environment and fall into place along with the ISO. This is what I mean by the chef adapting to the ingredients in front of them, right? Where I am looking at the lighting conditions, I'm looking at the environment, I'm looking at the subjects that might be available, the situation, how dynamic it is, and working backwards to decide what kind of image I want to capture, and then from there, deciding where the settings fall, instead of adopting one set of settings. The problem here is that a lot of people will lock their camera to f8 or f16 and just operate almost like gospel. And this leaves little room for learning, for adapting, to even grow as a creative. So when I get asked, what are the street photography settings that I use for my photography? The answer is whatever the environment gives me. Okay, let me just pause this video for 1 second because while I'm talking about developing your camera settings and your shortcuts and how do you get more of a command over your technology to capture your work, some of you might be wondering, Gajan, look, I just want to know what your camera settings are. Can we cut the bullshit? I've been following your work. I'm a fan of your imagery. I just want to know what are the settings that you use for the environments that you find yourself in. So if you're interested in that, visit my photo club. And those of you that are already subscribed, you would have seen this already, but I publish all of my settings for my camera and how do I use it in the different environments. So you can take that, copy that, remix that, adapt that, do whatever you like, but I have everything published there, and that should be useful in giving you guys a bit of a head start, or really just doing things that are opposite to me based on the work that you're capturing. Whatever it may be, check out my photo club. Every 2 weeks I publish a new post. It's free to join, and every month we're doing a contest. I really should talk about it more. Anyway, all the details are there below. Let's get back to this video. Now let's say that I'm going to be in one spot for an extended amount of time where I'm not going to be exploring the environment. I'm not moving from point to point. Well, I'll use a second system for my theory, and it's by the author of this book right here, Mr. Joel Meyerowitz. If you're a member of my photo club, you know I've talked about Joel multiple times and his master class. And in one of his sections, he talks about his color zone focus system. I've seen a lot of people give their spin on this system, but Joel was the first to talk about it, at least for me, and he does so regularly and probably in the most succinct way possible. Now, I'm gonna summarize it for you, but if you're really into this, I think you should check out his masterclass. What the gist of this involves is that if you're gonna be in one place, you're gonna be in one environment, you are going to meter your camera for that environment for the time that you are there and use those settings for about an hour. Now, how does this work? Well, you find your position. Maybe you're in an intersection or crosswalk and it's very busy and you have people coming to you and you might be shifting a little bit, but you're largely in one spot. You position yourself, you then hold out your hand in front of you with your palm facing towards your camera. And what Joel says is that when you hold your palm in front of you and you create those creases and fold, it almost mimics the face. It almost mimics the face and how it reacts to light. So if subjects are coming toward you, they're gonna be facing you. So you use your palm, you hold it out in front of you where the light can hit it. And then from there, you sort of move your hand left and right, up and down, and you'll see these shadows starting to form on your hand. From that, what you're trying to do is finding that balance where there's an equal amount of light and shadow. You try to find that sweet spot, right? Where you're not creating too much highlight, you're not creating too much shadow, and then you hold your camera and you take a reading. You see where the settings fall. So based on this, you might decide that, okay, I want my aperture to be around f4, this sort of like cinematic range, right? So based on that, you take a reading and you might say, okay, it looks like the shutter speed is falling to 1/500 and the ISO is about 640. You then lock all of those settings and you work the scene for the next hour with those settings. As the light changes, you take another reading and you adjust your settings accordingly. As you change positions, you might do the same. But once you have the reading, once you have that sort of place of homeostasis, you can also adjust them inversely as needed to get a different result. Maybe you want less focus, so you can open up that aperture, and to compensate for that, you might increase the shutter speed or drop the ISO, or both. Or you might want to get more of the scene and you're comfortable with introducing more grain. So you say, you know what, let's go to f8 and let's bring that ceiling of ISO to 3200 and lock it there. The beauty about this system is that it gives you a very simple tool that you have with you most times than not, your hand, and you're using that to get a pretty accurate reading of what an exposure might look like. This system is a little bit more involved, but again, we are letting our environment dictate our approach. We're not coming in with a recipe that we're trying to lather on this place. We're not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. We are just adapting to the environment around us. Here's the kicker. These two systems, they're just the beginning. We also have, like I mentioned before, shutter speed and ISO that we can creatively use to get a different result. You can tighten up your aperture and drop your shutter speed in low light environments to get these dreamlike images, right? That have a different feeling to them. In another instance, we can throw up our ISO ceiling. Maybe we're in the cover of night, where we can really open up that aperture, lock the shutter speed to a safe place, and have a really high ISO to get these grainy images that introduce more texture and drama to a photograph. All of this can help bring a new dimension to our work. What if we could flesh out our menu? What if we could flesh out the different kinds of images that we can create? Another reality to consider is that we're gonna seldom have those perfect situations like I mentioned in this video. The people, the sun, the world, depending on where you're standing, it's all gonna come through differently. So why not put ourselves in a position where we can create our best work in any situation? With that in mind, the best thing we can do for ourselves is learn how to adapt our technology regardless of what situation we're in, being able to instinctively move a few buttons and dials to get the shot we creatively need. Or if I could say it more simply, don't learn any recipes. Learn how to cook. So you may have noticed I'm fleshing out the story behind how I create my images, right? My street and travel work. Previously, I talked about how I pack for my trips. Here, I talked about the approach I have to my photography when it comes to the technology itself. And in the future, I'm gonna talk about something as simple as how do you approach strangers to take portraits. I really wanna build this catalog that gives people a look into how I create the work that I'm creating, right? Naturally, these videos are not going to get the attention, the views, the engagement that my exhaustive review videos do. So if you've watched it, especially this far, and you enjoyed it, please do subscribe, like, and leave a comment with what you think, because it does make a difference in furthering this channel and allowing me to go and do more ambitious things. And let me also say, the summer has been pretty calm for me. It's gonna get really crazy. So I don't know what the frequency is gonna be for when these videos are gonna be coming out in September, October, but I'm documenting everything. I'm capturing everything. And I'll tell you, when those videos come out, it's gonna be some of my best work yet. So stay tuned for that. As always, my name's Gadgen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.